If you're one of those people that mix it up margins and markups, this is going to be a video for you. Because I promise you, if you're doing this, I promise you, you are losing a lot of money. Please don't do this to yourself. This is going to be a video for you to understand what's the difference between a margin and markup, and how do you translate margin into a markup and the other way around, markup into a margin. And also at the end of the video, I am going to give you a mnemonic so that you can go and whenever next time when you're confused about it, you can go remember it and you will know which one to use and which one does what. Please, please, please watch this video, especially if you're not sure about the margins and markups, because if you're not, you will be losing a lot of money, as I will demonstrate right now. So what I have here is a very simplified profit and loss statement. As you will see, they're round numbers so that we can clearly see what's happening. This is a company that it's making $1 million in revenue, and they also have about $400,000 in cost of goods sold. And after all of that, that gives them a gross profit of $600,000. And they have $500,000 in other expenses and rent, in salaries that they have to pay to their people, in marketing. They have to also pay their accountant, all that good stuff to operate a company. And after all is said and done, at the end of the day, they are left with $100,000 in net income. So now that we've looked at their profit and loss statements, let's take a look at their margins and markups. So what is their gross margin in this case? And if you guessed it's 60%, you would have been correct. And the way how we calculated this is we took gross profit, which is 600,000, and we divided it by revenue. So in this case, 600 divided by 1 million gives you 60% gross margin. The second margin is net margin. And net margin in this scenario is 10%. Again, the way how we calculated this, and you see there's a pattern here, net income or loss divided by revenue. That gives you your net margin. The question here is now, what do you think the markup on this particular scenario is? And if you guess 60%, that would have been very incorrect because the actual markup is 150%. And the way how we calculated this is we took gross profit, 600,000, divided by the cost of goods sold, 400,000. So you see that for us to be able to retain 60% of our revenue, we needed to mark up our cost at 150%. So whenever you think about the margins and the markups, think about margin, meaning how much does it need to stay in the business. In this case, in the business needs to stay 60% of the revenue. And how much do we need to mark up the cost, meaning how much do we need to add to the cost to get to the revenue that we want to get to? We need to add 150%. So 150% of 400,000 is $1 million. In this scenario, that means that for us to be able to retain 600,000, we need to mark up our cost 150%. So now let's say that we did not know any better, that margin is different than a markup and the percentage has to be completely different. And we wanted to go and hit 60% of gross margins. And we assume the gross margin is the same as gross markup. So we said, okay, we are going to mark it up at 60%. So we're going to mark up our cost 60%. So in this scenario, this is a profit and loss statement, where in this case, we're assuming the markup is the same as margin. What we're going to do is we are going to mark up, remember, we are adding to our cost 60%. So our revenue is going to be $640,000 because when we add 400,000, 60% to it, we get to 640,000. That is going to give us our gross profit of $240,000. But keep in mind, our operating expenses have not changed. They're still $500,000. At the end, our net income, it's actually a loss. It's going to be $260,000 loss just because we assume that a markup of 60% is the same as a margin of 60%. And that's when we are comparing it to our original profit and loss statement here. We have made $360,000 less, which is 36% less, just because we assume that a markup is the same as a margin, which is a big no-no. So in this case, let's say that we knew better, and we knew that to get to a 60% gross profit margin, we need to add 150% markup. We would have made 100,000 income. So here are these two formulas that I promised you at the beginning. Whenever you are converting margins into markups or markups into margins, you can use these formulas. So for this example, let's say that you have a 60% margin that you want to figure out how much of a markup do you need to have to reach that margin. Remember, margin is the number that you want to stay in the business, margin. Markup is the percentage or the number that you need to add to cost of your product or service to get to a certain revenue. So in this case, I want to retain 60% in the business as a gross profit. So I want to reach my gross margin as 60%. So in this case, I need to add a markup to the cost of 150%. So the formula for that is markup equals margin divided parentheses 1 minus margin. So in this case, it would be 60% divided 1 minus 60%. That will give you your goal of 60% margin. You need to add 150% to your cost to get to the revenue that you need to get to. The other way is true as well. If you have 150% of markup, what will that translate into margin? So in this case, 150% markup is going to translate into 60% gross profit margin or margin. In this case, the way how you would go and calculate this, you would put 150% markup divided 1 plus 150%. That will give you a margin that is associated with that particular markup. So if let's say that I wanted to do a markup of 100%, that will give me 50% margin. But let's say if I want to do a markup of 200%, that will give me a margin of 67%. And here's a mnemonic to memorize this. Again, when you're thinking about margins, is how much is it going to stay in the business? Margin stays in the business. And with markup, you're thinking about cost. How much do you have to add to the cost plus up, to get to the revenue that you want to see? So margin, how much stays in the business. Markup, how much you need to add to the cost.